The Serpent's Coil River didn't give up its secrets easily. It was a churning, merciless beast of mud and rock, and on that blistering Tuesday afternoon, it had a woman in its teeth. Finian O'Connell, a man more accustomed to wrestling steers than saving souls, spurred his horse into the torrent. He saw only a tangle of dark hair and the pale flash of a hand. He fought the current his own life, a coin toss in the churning water, all for a stranger. But as he dragged her ashore, sputtering and broken, he had no idea he wasn't just pulling a woman from the river. He was pulling his world and the entire Redstone territory into a storm of lies, power, and secrets that began with the most dangerous discovery of all. She was no simple traveler. She was the daughter of the most powerful man for 500 miles, and she was supposed to be dead. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Redstone territory, beating the parched land into a state of weary submission. It baked the dust on Finian O'Connell's boots, cracked the leather of his saddle, and bleached the very hope from the sky, turning it a pale, hazy blue. His ranch, the Stargazer, was dying of thirst. The creek that fed his northern pasture had dwindled to a muddy trickle weeks ago, a casualty of the relentless drought, and Finian suspected the ever-expanding thirst of Bartholomew Thorne's empire upstream. Every day was a battle, a slow grinding war fought against heat dust and the encroaching shadow of foreclosure from the Redstone Territorial Bank, a bank that Thorne practically owned. Finian was pushing his dwindling herd toward the Serpent's Coil River, the last reliable source of water, his mind a maelstrom of numbers that refused to add up. The bay mare beneath him, Daisy shifted nervously, her ears twitching. She sensed his tension, a low hum of desperation that had become his constant companion. He was 24, with shoulders broadened by labor, and a face that was beginning to show the lines of worry that belonged to a much older man. His father had left him the Stargazer Ranch with a legacy of pride and a mountain of debt. Finian was determined to honor the first and conquer the second, but the world seemed determined to see him fail. That's when he saw it. A flicker of color against the monotonous brown of the riverbank. Something that didn't belong. Not a coyote or a fallen log. It was fabric a deep emerald green snagged on a skeletal cottonwood root near the water's edge. He reined Daisy, in his eyes narrowing. The Serpent's Coil was treacherous, its currents, as unpredictable as a rattlesnake's strike. Locals knew to respect it, to cross only at the shallow fords. Travelers were often less wise. He dismounted the squeak of leather, loud in the oppressive silence. As he drew closer, a cold dread snaked its way up his spine, a feeling far colder than the river water itself. The emerald fabric was the torn hem of a dress, a fine dress made of silk, or something close to it, the kind of material you'd see on a banker's wife in Salvation Creek, not on a woman out in the rugged wilderness. Then he saw the rest of her. She was caught in the river's main channel, tangled in a snarl of debris and branches, her body tossed and turned by the relentless current. Her face was turned away, a mass of dark, wet hair obscuring it. For a terrifying second, he thought she was already gone, another soul claimed by the river's cold embrace. But then her hand, pale and slender, broke the surface, fingers weakly clawing at nothing. There was no time for thought, only instinct. Finian kicked off his boots, dropped his hat onto the dusty ground, and plunged into the churning water. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and shocking his sun-baked skin. The current was stronger than it looked, a muscular, invisible hand that grabbed at his legs, trying to pull him under, to drag him downstream toward the treacherous rapids known as the Devil's Teeth. He fought it, his arms pumping his legs, kicking against the powerful flow. He was a strong swimmer, raised on this very land, but the river was in a foul mood. Mud and silt clouded the water, and he could feel the slick, unseen rocks beneath his feet. He reached the debris pile, his lungs burning. "Hang on!" He yelled, his voice rough and swallowed by the river's roar. "I've got you." He grabbed her arm. It was limp, unnervingly so. With a surge of adrenaline, he worked to untangle her from the branches that held her captive. Her dress, now a ruined mess of green, was snagged tight. He yanked, tearing the expensive fabric without a second thought. He finally pulled her free, and the current immediately tried to rip her from his grasp. He wrapped one arm securely around her chest, holding her head above water, and began the grueling fight back to shore. It was a battle of inches. The river pushed, and he pushed back. His muscles screamed in protest. His lungs felt as if they were filled with fire and water. He could feel her slight weight, a dead weight against him, and a fresh wave of fear washed over him. Was he too late? Finally, his feet found purchase on the muddy riverbed. He stumbled, half carrying, half dragging her out of the water and onto the scorching bank. He collapsed beside her, gasping for air, his body trembling with exertion and cold. For a moment, he just lay there, the sun beating down on his soaked clothes. Then he rolled over and looked at the woman he had pulled from the river. She was unconscious, her face, alarmingly pale lips tinged with blue. Water trickled from the corner of her mouth. Her dark hair was plastered to her face and neck, and a nasty gash marred her temple blood, mingling with the river water. Despite the dirt and the injury, there was a delicacy to her features, a refinement that was as out of place as her ruined silk dress. Her hands were soft, uncalloused. This was no rancher's wife or homesteader's daughter. Acting on pure instinct, he turned her onto her side and pressed firmly on her back. Water gushed from her mouth. She gave a choked, sputtering cough, then another. Her chest hitched, and she drew in a ragged, shallow breath. Her eyelids fluttered open. The eyes that met his were the color of a stormy sky, a deep, hazy gray, filled with confusion and terror. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. She pushed herself up weakly, her body racked with shivers. "You're safe," Finian said, his voice still ragged. "You're out of the water. Just breathe." She stared at him, her gaze darting around at the desolate landscape, the scattered cattle, the imposing, sun-bleached bluffs. This was not a place she knew. This was the edge of nowhere. Panic flared in her eyes. Who are you?" she rasped, her voice fragile. "Finian O'Connell. My ranch is just over that rise," he said, gesturing vaguely. "What's your name? What happened? Was there a wagon accident?" She hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. It wasn't just disorientation, it was calculation. He saw it plain as day. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if gathering her strength, not just physical, but mental. When she opened them again, the raw panic was shielded behind a veneer of composure. "My name," she said, her voice a little stronger, "is Rose. Rose Smith. Our wagon. Yes, an accident. At the ford upstream. I was thrown clear. I don't know about the others." A single convincing tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Finian frowned. He hadn't heard of any wagon train passing through. News travelled fast in this sparse country. Still, it was possible. He looked at her torn dress, her soft hands. She was clearly a lady of means. The name Smith was as common as dirt, a perfect name for someone who didn't want to be found. But why would a wealthy woman want to hide her identity? He pushed the suspicion aside. She was hurt, freezing despite the oppressive heat, and clearly in shock. Questions could wait. He stood up, his wet clothes clinging to him, and walked to Daisy. He unstrapped his bedroll, a simple wool blanket. "Here." he said, returning to her side and draping it around her shivering shoulders. It's not much, but it's dry. We need to get you warmed up. Can you ride? She nodded numbly, pulling the rough blanket tighter around herself. He helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, leaning heavily on him. He could feel the fine bones of her arm beneath the wet silk. Up close, he could smell the faint, incongruous scent of lavender clinging to her, a ghost of another life. He led her to Daisy, who snorted at the smell of the river on them. He easily lifted the woman into the saddle, her slight weight, no burden at all, and then swung up behind her. She slumped back against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, a tremor running through her. As he urged Daisy homeward, Finian O'Connell couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just saved a life. The river had given him something, but it felt less like a gift and more like a secret. A secret named Rose Smith with stormy grey eyes, and a story that felt as thin and torn as her emerald green dress. He was a man drowning in his own troubles, and he had a terrible feeling he'd just pulled someone else's into his boat. The Stargazer Ranch homestead was not a place of luxury. It was a testament to stubborn persistence, built of hand-hewn logs and sheer grit by Finian's father and grandfather. The main house was modest, with a wide shaded porch that offered the only real respite from the sun. A sturdy barn, a corral, and a few outbuildings completed the small kingdom that Finian was fighting so hard to protect. To him it was everything. To the woman he now carried across the threshold, it must have looked like the end of the world. He laid her gently on his own bed in the small spare bedroom. The room smelled of cedar-rolled books and clean linen. It was a stark contrast to the life she hinted at. He built up the fire in the main room's hearth, not for warmth against the day's heat, but to chase the deep, river-borne chill from her bones. He found a set of his late mother's clothes, a simple practical cotton dress and underthings, and left them on a chair for her, along with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. "I'll be outside," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Call if you need anything. The dress isn't fancy, but it's clean and dry." He closed the door, giving her privacy she probably wasn't used to needing, and leaned against the rough-hewn wall in the main room. The silence of the house was suddenly different. It was no longer the lonely silence of a man working himself to the bone. It was a charged silence, filled with the presence of the unknown. He looked at his calloused hands, then at the closed bedroom door. He had dealt with cattle rustlers' droughts and bank notices. He had no idea how to deal with a woman like her. An hour later, she emerged. She had washed the dirt and blood from her face, revealing the true extent of the cut on her temple, now a dark, angry purple. Her wet hair was combed back, hanging in damp ringlets down her back. The simple faded calico dress hung loosely on her slender frame, the worn fabric a world away from the ruined silk he'd pulled from the river. But even in borrowed humble clothes, she possessed an undeniable air of grace and breeding. It was in the way she held her head, the straightness of her spine, the quiet dignity in her stormy eyes. "Thank you, Mr. O'Connell," she said, her voice clear and steady now, "for your kindness, and your mother's clothes." "It's just Finian, and you're welcome, Miss Smith," he replied, watching her carefully. He handed her a steaming mug of coffee, strong and black. "You should eat something." He'd made a simple stew, more out of habit than hospitality, but she ate it with a quiet gratitude that seemed genuine. They sat at the small wooden table his father had built, the silence stretching between them. He wanted to ask her 100 questions. Where was she really from? Who were the others in the wagon? Why did she look like she'd just stepped out of a portrait in the governor's mansion? But he held his tongue. Prying wasn't his way. and she looked as fragile as a newborn foal. As the days turned into a week, a strange domesticity settled over the stargazer. Rose was a quick study. She insisted on earning her keep, though her attempts at ranch chores were initially clumsy. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands gradually toughening. She learned to mend his work shirts with stitches far neater than his own clumsy attempts. She wasn't strong, but she was tireless, driven by a quiet, fierce determination that impressed him. During the long, quiet evenings, they would sometimes talk. She spoke of a life in a distant city of books and music and manicured gardens. She spoke of it all in the past tense, as if describing a life that belonged to someone else. Her stories were vivid but vague, filled with beautiful descriptions, but empty of names, places, or personal connections. She was building a wall of words, and Finian knew it. One evening, as she sat by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, she recounted a memory of attending a grand ball. She described the music of the orchestra, the weight of a beaded gown, the intricate steps of a waltz. Her eyes grew distant, and for a moment the weary woman in the faded dress vanished, replaced by someone else, someone luminous and confident. "You miss that life," Finian stated more than asked. Her reverie shattered. The light in her eyes died, replaced by a guarded, almost haunted look. "Sometimes," she said softly, her gaze dropping to the mending in her lap. "Sometimes I miss the beauty of it. But beauty can be a cage, Mr. O'Connell. A gilded one, but a cage all the same." That night she was plagued by nightmares. Finian was woken by a cry from her room. He found her sitting bolt upright in bed, her face pale in the moonlight, her hands clenched in the blanket. "He'll find me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll drag me back." "Who will?" Finian asked, stepping into the room. "Rose, who are you afraid of?" She looked at him, her eyes wide, with a terror that was bone-deep and real. My fiancé," she stammered the word, tasting like poison in her mouth. "The man I was supposed to marry. My father arranged it." The pieces began to click into place for Finian. The fancy dress, the escape, the fear. This wasn't an accident. This was a flight. "Your father," she continued the words, spilling out in a torrent of confession, "is a very powerful man. He sees people as pawns on a chessboard, daughters included. He arranged my marriage to unite two powerful families, to consolidate wealth and influence. It was a business transaction. It had nothing to do with love or even respect." She described her fiancé, Montgomery Thorne, not as a monster, but as something worse, a man of cold, possessive ambition, a mirror of his own father. A man who saw her as a beautiful acquisition, a trophy to be displayed. "He didn't see me," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He saw a prize, and my father saw a treaty. I was being sold. So I ran. I paid a farmer to take me west in his wagon under a false name. I was going to disappear, start a new life, when no one knew me." She finally looked at him, her confession hanging in the air. "But the farmer got greedy. He heard rumors of a reward for a missing heiress. He must have figured it out. Near the ford, he tried to restrain me, to take me back. I fought him. I ran, and I just kept running until I reached the river. I thought if I could get across, I could lose him. I never imagined the current would be so strong." She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I thought it was better to drown than to go back to that cage." Finian stood in the doorway, the moonlight casting a long shadow behind him. He finally understood. The wagon accident was a lie to cover a desperate escape. Rose Smith was a shield. She wasn't running from a stranger. She was running from a life that was suffocating her, a life of immense privilege and zero freedom. He looked at her huddled in the bed, looking so small and vulnerable, and felt a surge of protectiveness that startled him with its intensity. He knew her secret now, or at least part of it. He still didn't know her real name or the name of the powerful father she spoke of. But he knew she was in trouble, the kind of trouble that didn't just fade away. The kind of trouble that had long arms and powerful friends. And she was here on his ranch, a place already under siege. He was hiding a fugitive, and he hadn't even known it. "You're safe here," he said, the words coming out with more conviction than he felt. "No one will find you here." As he walked back to his makeshift bedroll by the dying fire, he knew he was lying. Sooner or later, her world would come looking for her. And when it did, it would crash headlong into his. 2 weeks after her arrival, the Stargazer's meager supplies were running dangerously low. Flour, salt, coffee, the basic necessities of survival were almost gone. Finian had been putting off the trip to Salvation Creek, wary of taking Rose into town, but necessity left him no choice. She couldn't be left alone for the full day it would take him to ride in and back, and the thought of leaving her unprotected gnawed at him. "You'll have to come with me," he announced one morning, over a breakfast of thin cornmeal mush. "We'll say you're my cousin from back east, helping out for a spell. Just keep your head down and let me do the talking." Rose agreed, though a shadow of fear passed over her features. For the journey she braided her dark hair tightly and pulled one of his old wide-brimmed hats low over her face, obscuring her features. In the faded calico dress and worn leather boots he'd found for her, she looked passable as a homesteader's kin, as long as no one looked too closely at the fine lines of her face or the aristocratic grace in her posture. The ride to Salvation Creek was tense. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by wooden storefronts, a collection of souls clinging to the edge of the wilderness. It was the hub of their corner of the territory, a place for commerce, gossip, and trouble. Today it felt like a trap. They tied the horses to the hitching post outside the Salvation Creek Mercantile, a sprawling general store run by a shrewd, hawk-nosed man named Arthur Pennyworth. The moment they stepped inside, the familiar smells of leather coffee beans and dried apples enveloped them. A few ranchers and townsfolk milled about their conversations, dropping to a low murmur as they eyed the newcomer with Finian. Strangers were a curiosity, and a woman stranger doubly so. Finian went about his business, calmly ordering his supplies from Pennyworth, acutely aware of Rose standing silently by his side. She kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, the brim of her hat casting her face in shadow. It was by the pickle barrel that he heard it. Two cattlemen, their faces leathery from the sun, were talking in low, serious tones. "Terrible business what happened to the judge's girl," one of them said, shaking his head. "They found the wagon, you know, up by the North Ford. Driver was gone, but signs of a struggle. Looks like she was taken." Finian's blood ran cold. He feigned interest in a display of new lasso ropes, positioning himself to hear better. "Taken?" the other man scoffed. "More likely she tried to cross the serpent's coil and got swept away. They say Thorne's son Montgomery is beside himself with grief. Rode out with 12 men to search the riverbanks himself. A real tragedy. Judge Abernathy has put up a $500 reward for any information. $500, can you believe it?" Judge Abernathy. The name hit Finian like a physical blow. Judge Lawrence Abernathy was the most powerful, most feared man in the Redstone Territory. He was a man of iron will and unbending law whose influence reached from the territorial capital to the smallest, most remote homestead. He was known for his brilliant legal mind and his cold, calculating demeanor. And he was, as luck would have it, a close political and financial ally of Bartholomew Thorne. Finian glanced at Rose. She was perfectly still, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. She had heard it too. Her powerful father was Judge Abernathy. Her gilded cage was the home of the man who held the law in the palm of his hand. And the man she was supposed to marry, Montgomery Thorne, was the son of the very man squeezing the life out of the Stargazer Ranch. The puzzle with all its terrible jagged pieces snapped together. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a collision of the two most powerful forces in the territory. Rose hadn't just run from a marriage. She had sabotaged a strategic alliance. As if the day wasn't fraught enough, the mercantile's door swung open with a jangle of the bell, and in walked Lyle Cobb, Bartholomew Thorne's foreman. Cobb was a big man with a permanent scowl etched onto his face and eyes as cold and grey as river stones. He moved with the swagger of a man who knew he was backed by power, and he radiated a quiet menace that made other men step aside. He was Thorne's fist, the one who delivered threats and carried out the dirty work. Cobb's eyes swept the room, and for a heart-stopping moment, they rested on Rose. Finian instinctively stepped forward, partially blocking her from view. "O'Connell!" Cobb grunted, his gaze shifting to Finian. The greeting was an accusation. "Didn't figure you for having the coin for a big supply run. Heard the bank's about to call in your marker." "My finances are my own business, Cobb," Finian said, his voice level, though his heart was pounding against his ribs. He had to get Rose out of there. Cobb smirked, a nasty, humorless expression. "Everything on this land is Mr. Thorne's business sooner or later. He's a patient man, but his patience is wearing thin. Especially now with the tragedy of his son's fiancée. He's in no mood for trifles." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing again on Rose, who seemed to shrink behind Finian. "Who's this? Don't recognize her." "My cousin," Finian said quickly, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt peacemaker on his hip. "Helping out." Cobb looked from Finian's hard face to the woman hiding behind him. He grunted again, unconvinced, but uninterested in pressing the matter. His purpose was intimidation, and he felt he had made his point. He turned to the counter to place his own order, dismissing them. Finian grabbed his sacks of flour and coffee. "Let's go," he muttered to Rose. They walked quickly out of the mercantile, the eyes of everyone in the store following them. They didn't breathe easily until they were on their horses and riding out of Salvation Creek, the dusty street shrinking behind them. They rode in silence for the first mile, the weight of what they'd heard pressing down on them. The world now believed that Rosalind Abernathy, the judge's daughter, was the victim of a kidnapping, or worse, dead, drowned in the serpent's coil. A massive search was underway, led by the very man she had fled. "So," Finian finally said, breaking the silence. "Rosalind Abernathy." She flinched at the name. She looked at him, her face pale, the brim of her hat no longer able to hide the terror in her eyes. "You heard." "The whole town's heard," he replied grimly. "Daughter of Judge Abernathy, betrothed to Montgomery Thorne, you didn't just run away, Rosalind. You declared war." "My name is Rose," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "Rosalind Abernathy ceased to exist when she went into that river." "It doesn't matter what you call yourself," Finian countered, his frustration boiling over. This was his ranch, his life she had endangered. "They're looking for you, Thorne the judge. They will turn over every rock in this territory. And what do you think they'll do when they find you hiding on the ranch of a man Bartholomew Thorne is trying to crush?" Her face fell, the full implication of her situation crashing down on her. She had thought only of her own escape, her own freedom. She had never considered the collateral damage. She had dragged this quiet, struggling rancher into her personal war. a war he had no chance of winning. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate. "Finian, I am so sorry. I never meant to bring this on you." He looked at her at the genuine remorse and fear in her eyes, and his anger subsided, replaced by a grim resignation. It was too late for apologies. They were in this together now, whether he liked it or not. The whispers in Salvation Creek were just the beginning. The storm was coming for the Stargazer Ranch. The news from town changed everything. The relative peace of the Stargazer was shattered, replaced by a constant humming anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant rider a potential enemy. Finian started carrying his rifle with him, everywhere, even on the short walk from the house to the barn. Rosalind, he still thought of her as Rose, became withdrawn, starting at every sound, her days punctuated by long periods of staring out at the unforgiving landscape, as if willing it to swallow her whole. They both knew it was only a matter of time. Bartholomew Thorne was not a man to leave things to chance. Believing Rose to be dead, he no longer had to tread carefully around Judge Abernathy. The proposed alliance through marriage was gone. Now all that remained was raw ambition. Without the social and political cover, the union would have provided Thorne accelerated his plans to consolidate his power, starting with the small ranchers he considered pests, starting with Finian O'Connell. The confrontation came less than a week after their trip to town. Finian was replacing a rotten post on the corral fence, the rhythmic thud of his hammer, the only sound in the hot afternoon air. Rose was inside churning butter, finding a small measure of peace in the mindless, repetitive task. Finian saw the dust cloud first, a rising plume on the horizon that signaled more than one rider. He straightened up his hand, automatically going to the pistol at his hip. He watched as 3 horsemen crested the rise and rode toward the homestead, their pace deliberate and arrogant. In the lead was Lyle Cobb, flanked by 2 other hard-faced men who wore their guns with casual familiarity. "Rose, get inside and stay there," Finian called out, his voice low and urgent. "Don't come out, no matter what." She appeared at the doorway, her face pale, a wooden spoon clutched in her hand. She saw the riders, and the color drained completely from her face. She nodded, once her eyes wide with fear, and disappeared back into the shadows of the house. Finian stood his ground by the corral, his hammer still in his hand, a poor weapon against 3 guns, but a comfort nonetheless. He didn't move as the riders drew up before him, their horses kicking up dust that settled on his clothes. "O'Connell," Cobb said, not bothering to dismount. He looked down from his saddle, the position of power deliberate. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Thorne and the Redstone Territorial Bank. This is your final notice of foreclosure." He tossed the paper into the dust at Finian's feet. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The property and all assets, including livestock, will be forfeit to the bank to settle your outstanding debt." Finian stared at the paper, then back up at Cobb, his jaw tight. 30 days. My agreement was for 90. I have 2 more months. Cobb's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Circumstances have changed. The bank has reviewed your account and deemed the loan too high a risk to continue. It's all legal and binding. Your father took a foolish risk, O'Connell. Now you pay the price." "This isn't about risk. This is about Thorne wanting my water rights." Finian shot back, his voice rising with controlled fury. "He's been choking my creek for months, trying to starve me out. Now he's just done waiting." "Mr. Thorne is a businessman," Cobb said smoothly. "He sees an opportunity, he takes it. You see a dying ranch. He sees progress. In 30 days this land will belong to him. I suggest you don't make this difficult." He gestured to the 2 men with him. "We're here to do a preliminary inventory of the bank's assets." One of the men dismounted and started walking toward the barn. "Get off my land," Finian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He took a step forward, the hammer held tight in his fist. Cobb chuckled. "Your land? Not for much longer. Don't be a fool, O'Connell. You can't win this." The foreman's hand drifted down, resting casually on the handle of his pistol. It was a clear, unambiguous threat. From inside the house, hidden behind the thin lace curtain of the front window, Rose watched her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the arrogance of Cobb, the quiet, defiant fury of Finian. She saw the foreclosure notice lying in the dirt like a death sentence, and she understood with chilling clarity that this was her fault. Thorn was moving against Finian because he thought she was dead. Her death had untied Thorn's hands, freeing him to act with impunity. Her desperate bid for freedom had brought ruin to the one person who had shown her kindness, the one man who had offered her shelter without asking for anything in return. She had traded her gilded cage for a different kind of prison, one where she had to watch helplessly as an innocent man paid the price for her choices. The rancher Finian was arguing with a man named Henderson, made a move toward the small herd of cattle in the corral. "Nice-looking stock," Henderson sneered. "They'll fetch a good price at auction." That was the breaking point. With a roar of frustration, Finian threw the hammer aside. He was no killer and launched himself at Henderson. The element of surprise was on his side. He tackled the man to the ground, and they rolled in the dust fists flying. Finian was strong from years of hard labor, and he landed 2 solid punches before the third man and Cobb were off their horses. One of them grabbed Finian from behind, pulling him into a chokehold. Cobb strode over his face, a mask of cold fury. He drew his pistol not to shoot, but to use as a club. He brought the heavy barrel down in a vicious arc, striking Finian across the side of the head. Finian cried out as pain exploded behind his eyes. The world swam in a dizzying haze of black and white. The arms holding him let go, and he crumpled to the ground, the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth. "That's enough," Cobb snarled, holstering his weapon. He looked down at Finian, who was struggling to push himself up his head, reeling. "That was a warning, O'Connell. Don't be here in 30 days. We won't be so polite next time." He and his men mounted their horses. Cobb cast one last lingering look at the house before turning his horse and riding away, leaving Finian kneeling in the dust, the foreclosure notice fluttering nearby. The moment they were gone, Rose burst from the house, her face a mask of horror and guilt. She rushed to Finian's side, helping him to his feet as he staggered. "Finian, are you all right?" she cried, her hands fluttering uselessly around the bleeding gash on his temple. "I'm fine," he grunted, shaking his head to clear it, an action he immediately regretted as a fresh wave of pain shot through him. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw not just quiet strength, but a flicker of true despair in his eyes. He had fought so hard for so long, and it was all for nothing. "This is my fault," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "All of this. Thorn the bank, this. It's all because of me. I ran away to be free, but all I've done is put you in a cage of your own." He looked from her tear-streaked face to the notice in the dirt, then to the ranch his father had poured his life into. She was right. Her presence had brought the storm to his door, but seeing the raw power and undisguised greed of Thorn's men firsthand had ignited something else in him, besides despair, a cold, hard anger. And for Rose, the sight of Finian being struck down for defending his home was a crucible, her guilt transformed into a burning resolve. Hiding was no longer an option. Running was a coward's game. They couldn't fight Thorn and her father on their terms with money and influence they didn't have. But she was Judge Abernathy's daughter. She knew how men like them thought. They were arrogant. They were powerful. And powerful, arrogant men always had secrets. "No," she said, her voice shaking but filled with a new steely determination. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. "This isn't over. They think I'm dead. They think you're beaten. They're wrong. We're not going to run, Finian. We're going to fight." He looked at her, surprised by the sudden fire in her eyes. The helpless, frightened woman he'd pulled from the river was gone. In her place stood someone else, entirely. Someone who looked for all the world like a judge's daughter. In the aftermath of Cobb's visit, a fragile hope born of shared desperation took root in the small log house. The foreclosure notice, smoothed out and placed on the mantelpiece, was no longer just a death sentence. It was a declaration of war. The 30-day timeline was a ticking clock, counting down to a confrontation they had to win. That evening, as Finian cleaned the gash on his head with a rag soaked in whiskey, Rose paced the floor, her mind racing. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a righteous fury she hadn't known she possessed. "They think they're untouchable," she said, her voice sharp. "My father and Thorn, they operate in a world of laws they write themselves. They use contracts, debts, and politics as weapons. We can't beat them with fists or guns." "So how do we beat them?" Finian asked, his voice rough. He winced as the whiskey stung his wound. "They hold all the cards, Rose. The bank, the law, the money." She stopped pacing and looked at him, her grey eyes intense. "We find a card they don't know we have. We expose them. Men like Thorn don't build empires legally. They cut corners, they bribe, they threaten. There has to be proof. Something my father, for all his flaws, cannot ignore, especially if it's made public." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than the slow, agonizing certainty of losing everything. The first step was the hardest. Rose had to fully embrace the identity she had shed. She had to become Rosalind Abernathy again, not in dress, but in mind. She sat with Finian for hours, explaining the intricate web of relationships and power in the territorial capital. She detailed Thorn's business dealings, as she had overheard them at countless dinner parties, land acquisitions, water rights disputes, railroad grants. She was more than just a debutante. She had been a silent observer, and she had a keen memory. "Thorn's entire operation depends on controlling water," she explained, drawing a crude map of the territory in the dust on the floor. "He's not just buying ranches, he's buying the creeks and rivers that feed them. He's been doing it for years, slowly, methodically. But the drought has made him impatient. He's getting sloppy." "Sloppy how?" Finian pressed, leaning forward, his own troubles momentarily forgotten as he became engrossed in her strategy. "He uses the bank to force foreclosures, but the paperwork has to look legitimate. To do that, he often has to forge signatures on deeds or bribe land office clerks to lose competing claims. My father prides himself on the sanctity of a contract. Forged documents. That's a crime he couldn't overlook without becoming a hypocrite, and he despises hypocrisy above all else." Their target was clear. They needed concrete evidence of Bartholomew Thorn's fraudulent activities, evidence strong enough to force Judge Abernathy's hand. But where would they find such a thing? "His main office is in Salvation Creek," Finian said, thinking aloud. "A brick building next to the bank. He keeps all his records there." "It would be a fortress," Rose countered, "and Cobb is likely never far from it. We can't risk a direct approach." They needed an inside source, someone who hated Thorne enough to risk his wrath. Finian's mind turned to the whispers and grumblings he'd heard among other ranchers' men who had been squeezed by Thorne's tactics over the years. One name stood out. Elias Vance, Finian said. He owned the Triple Creek Ranch north of here. Thorne forced him out 2 years ago over a water rights claim that Vance swore was fabricated. He's an old man now, broken and bitter. Lives in a small cabin on the edge of town, does odd jobs. He hates Thorne more than any man I know. It was a slim chance. Vance was known to be cantankerous and distrustful, but he was their only lead. The next day, Finian rode out alone, leaving Rose at the ranch with his rifle and strict instructions not to open the door to anyone. He found Elias Vance behind his small, dilapidated cabin, chopping firewood with a weary, rhythmic swing of his axe. Vance was a rail-thin man, with a face like a dried-up riverbed and eyes that burned with a banked, resentful fire. Finian approached cautiously. "Mr. Vance?" The old man stopped resting on his axe handle and eyed Finian with suspicion. "O'Connell. Heard Cobb paid you a visit. Come to cry on my shoulder." "No," Finian said simply. "I've come to fight." Vance snorted a dry, rattling sound. "Fight Thorne. I tried that. Lost everything I ever worked for. My ranch. My wife's grave. It's all his now. You can't fight a man who owns the judge and the bank." "What if you could?" Finian pressed, lowering his voice. "What if you could prove he cheated you? Prove he's cheated dozens of others?" Vance's eyes narrowed. "Words are wind, boy. You need paper, proof, and Thorne's got that locked up tighter than a drum." "I have help," Finian said, taking a calculated risk. "Someone who knows how Thorne and the judge operate. Someone they'd never suspect." He didn't say more, but the implication hung in the air. He watched the old man's face, saw the flicker of curiosity warring with years of ingrained cynicism. Vance spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Thorne keeps 2 sets of books," Vance said, finally his voice a low growl. "Everyone knows it. One for the public, for the bank examiners, and another one, a private ledger. That's where he keeps the real records, the bribes, the forged deeds, the names of the men he's paid off." "Where does he keep it?" Finian asked, his heart starting to beat faster. "In his office, in a safe behind a portrait of President Grant. Big ugly thing. But you'll never get to it. He keeps the office locked, and Cobb's got the only other key." This was it. The key to everything. A ledger that could bring Thorne's empire crashing down. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward was freedom for both Finian and Rose. When Finian returned to the Stargazer and told Rose what he had learned, she became deathly still. The color drained from her face. Breaking into the office of the most dangerous man in the territory was a suicidal plan. But as she looked at Finian's determined face, and then at the foreclosure notice on the mantel, she knew there was no other way. "My father gave me a gift once," she said slowly, her mind working furiously. "For my 18th birthday. A set of pearl hairpins. He said a lady should always have the right tools for any situation. They were made by a master locksmith in the city. The ends are fine-tempered steel. I was taught how to use them to open a jewelry box if the key was lost." Finian stared at her dumbfounded. "You can pick locks." A small, grim smile touched her lips. "I can open a jewelry box. A safe is a different matter. But the office door, perhaps. It's a risk. A terrible risk." The plan that formed between them was audacious and desperate. They would have to go into Salvation Creek at night during the new moon, when the darkness would be their ally. She would work on the lock of the back office door while he stood watch. If she could get them inside, they would have to find a way to open the safe. It was a gambit worthy of a judge's daughter, a high-stakes play where one wrong move would mean not just failure but likely a noose. As they stood in the quiet twilight of the ranch, the enormity of what they were about to attempt settled over them. They were no longer just a rancher and a runaway. They were conspirators, partners in a dangerous game against a king with only their courage and a set of pearl hairpins as their weapons. Under the cover of a moonless night, they crept into the alley behind Thorne's office. With trembling hands, Rose produced 2 pearl hairpins and skillfully picked the lock on the heavy oak door. Inside, they found the safe hidden behind a portrait of President Grant, just as Elias Vance had described. The combination lock seemed insurmountable until a desperate guess at Thorne's arrogance gave them a key, the founding date of his prized bank. Rose expertly spun the dial to 41268, and with a heavy thunk, the iron door swung open. Inside was their prize, a secret ledger. They opened it in the dim lamplight, its pages a meticulous record of Thorne's empire of crime. There were details of bribes, names of paid-off officials, and Elias Vance's forged signature on his own deed. Most damning of all was the entry detailing the fraudulent fees designed to steal the Stargazer Ranch. Their triumph was cut short by the sound of heavy footsteps on the boardwalk outside, followed by the scrape of a key in the front door. It was Lyle Cobb. Panic flared. Finian grabbed the ledger, blew out the lamp, and they scrambled for the side window. They tumbled out into the alley's shadows, just as Cobb stepped into the office, his lantern held high. They had the truth clutched tight in their hands, but now they were fugitives running for their lives. Their plan was a desperate gambit, a public reckoning. On Friday morning, as Judge Abernathy held his open court session on the courthouse steps, Rose rode into Salvation Creek. Dressed in the same torn emerald silk she was found in, she was a ghost, returned from the grave, shocking the town and throwing the Thornes into disbelieving fury. Her appearance was the diversion Finian needed. He spurred his horse down the main street, the damning ledger clutched tight. "Stop him!" Bartholomew Thorne roared. Lyle Cobb and his men opened fire, the crowd scattering in terror. Just as Cobb drew a clear bead on Finian, a shotgun blast from old Elias Vance startled him, buying Finian a precious second. He vaulted from his saddle and charged up the courthouse steps, throwing the ledger at the judge's feet. "There is your justice!" Finian yelled above the chaos. Proof that Thorne built his empire on lies and theft. Rose's voice rang out, confronting her father before the whole town. Trapped between his defiant daughter, the damning evidence, and his corrupt ally, Judge Abernathy made his choice. His entire reputation and the sanctity of the law he championed were on the line. He slowly picked up the ledger, his face an unreadable mask. After a tense silence that held the entire square breathless, his voice cut through the air like cold steel. "Marshal, take Mr. Thorne and his son into custody." The fall was swift. Thorne's empire crumbled under the weight of his crimes. The Stargazer Ranch was saved, its fraudulent debt erased, and its future secure. Rose, finally free, chose not to return to her old life, but to build a new one in Salvation Creek alongside the quiet rancher who had saved her in more ways than one. That's the story of Finian O'Connell and Rosalind Abernathy, a tale of how one single act of courage can unravel an empire of deceit. It's a reminder that justice isn't always found in a courthouse, but sometimes has to be dragged dripping and fighting from the river of fate. It shows us that true strength isn't about the power you hold over others, but the integrity you hold within yourself. Their story proves that even in the harshest wilderness, against the most powerful foes, a partnership forged in truth can bring down giants. If you believe that courage can change the world, and that one person's stand can make all the difference, then please hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who loves a tale of the Old West, where the heroes win not just with their guns, but with their wits and their hearts. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of history drama and the untamed human spirit. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.